Number 5. Fort Drum Concrete Battleship. In the Philippines, near the opening of Manila Bay, directly south of the Corregidor Island, lies the highly defended island known as Fort Drum, also known as El Fraile. The sea fort was built by the United States in 1909 as one of the harbor fortifications at the larger South Channel entrance to the bay during the American colonial era. The reinforced concrete sea fort, sometimes known as concrete battleship, was designed, well, like a battleship. Given that it was a sea fort with turrets, it stood apart among the American forts constructed between the American Civil War and the beginning of World War II. It was taken over and held by the Japanese during World War II, but was later recovered after American forces started a fire from the inside, killing 68 Japanese soldiers and rendering it permanently inoperable. Due to the heat, it took 5 days before American forces could penetrate the stronghold. The now abandoned fort was named after Brigadier General Richard C. Drum, who distinguished himself throughout the American Civil War and the Mexican-American War before passing away on October 15, 1909, the year the fort was built. Cavite City is responsible for the island and the other extant harbor fortifications of Manila Bay. Fort Drum was initially intended to serve as a mine clearance and casemate post. The intent was to flatten the island and then erect a concrete building on top of it that was mounted with 4 12-inch cannons in twin mounts, owing to the area's insufficient defenses. The War Department received this and made the decision to switch the 12-inch guns with 14-inch guns installed in dual armored turrets. A deck made of steel-reinforced concrete 20 feet thick protected the fort from above. It was essentially impervious to hostile naval attacks since the external walls were between 25 and 36 feet thick. At the entrance of Manila Bay, Fort Drum's remains still stand, complete with its defunct turrets and 14-inch cannons. It's been abandoned since the conclusion of World War II. Looters began taking scrap metal from the fort in the 1970s to sell. According to a 2009 report, this conduct was still happening. Number 4. Ancient city of Heracleon. There were only a handful of historians that actually believed in the existence of Heracleon at the beginning of the 20th century. Most people simply saw it as a legend. Allegedly, the city sank into the ocean 1,500 years ago, following multiple natural disasters. The first time someone claimed to get a look at the mythical city was in 1930 when an RAF commander flying over Abu Qir saw something in the water that appeared to be ruins. The pilot's tale launched a new era of offshore research for this lost city, but with no luck. Technology was not advanced enough to make it possible for archaeologists to find anything. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Expert on modern maritime archaeology Frank Gaudio started looking for this city in 1996 with the support of the Hilti Foundation. Gaudio believes that the ground beneath the city had been affected by numerous natural catastrophes such as earthquakes that the soil collapsed, and over time the city began to sink. The late rise of water due to climate change also played a role by taking it even deeper underwater, therefore making it difficult to find. Thonis Heracleon and part of the city of Canopus were discovered mostly submerged in the Bay of Abu Qir at a depth of about 150 feet. Heracleon was once a very important city within ancient Egypt, as this was where all the Greek and other foreign trading ships would pass through. This was understood from the 64 naval ships that were found beneath the waves buried in the sand, most of them being Greek in origin. It wasn't just ships that were discovered. Many other things such as bronze statues, statues of Egyptian gods, gold coins, and dozens of small sarcophagi were also found. Gaudio and his team even found the shattered fragments of a colossal red granite statue of a pharaoh over 16 feet tall, weighing 5.5 tons. This could be the most crucial city within Egypt at the time, as it implemented a tax on imports and export, something that played a major role in building the wealth of Egypt. It also improved relationships with other nations around the world, at the same time opening new trade routes. Do you believe there could be more underwater cities discovered in the future? Tell us in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 3. Moon rocket engines. In a blog post from 2012, Jeff Bezos, the creator of Amazon.com, said on his Bezos Expeditions Venture Fund website that he had personally funded and oversaw an underwater excavation that had discovered portions of the massive F-1 rocket engines used by Apollo 11. Engines from the rocket have been located around 14,000 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida. Bezos intended to retrieve one or more of the engines for exhibition, and in 2013 he declared success. Parts from 4 F-1 engines were hauled back to the surface after spending more than 40 years below. It was hard to pinpoint precisely which flights the engines originated from. Even though Bezos Expeditions website stated that several of the original serial numbers are missing or partially lost, which is likely to make mission identification problematic, It's plausible that they're in fact from the SIC stage of Apollo 11. Each significant component of an F-1 engine had some type of serial number on it in order to be tracked through the production process. Every F-1 engine that was flown was hand-built and manually assembled. It would be easy to identify which Apollo missions the recovered components originated from if the serial numbers on them could be decoded. A video depicting portions of the recovery procedure is available on the Bezos expedition page. The engines are much beyond the reach of human divers at a depth of about 3 miles deeper than the Titanic's remains. Hence, the operation was carried out using remote-operated vehicles that were operated from the surface. The engines are enormous, measuring 19 feet from nozzle to fuel inlets and weighing around 20,000 pounds for a fully assembled F-1. It took a lot of skill to lift so much mass from the ocean floor, especially when the components had been corroded by seawater and were fragile. Rory Golden, the team's leader, previously collaborated with Dr. Robert Ballard to locate the Titanic, so it's fortunate that they have a lot of experience in underwater exploration and salvage. The team found enough components to build 2 complete F-1 engines. To combat the consequences of air exposure after being submerged in the ocean for so long, the parts must be restored and stabilized. But Bezos vowed that the rebuilt engines will be a centerpiece of a big museum-quality display. They wanted the hardware to reveal the entire truth, including the details of the 5,000-mile-per-hour re-entry and eventual collision with the ocean's surface. They were quite eager to put the equipment on display in the hopes that it would be inspirational. The engines, or rather the pieces of them because they've been broken apart and degraded, are placed next to a massive engine that is not in operation and serves as a reminder of how they looked before they were launched. The 2 are highlighted in Apollo, a new permanent display at the Museum of Flight that opened to the public on Saturday, May 20th, 2017, along with other NASA artifacts. Number 2. Baltic Sea Anomaly. In June 2011, a blurry sonar image of the northern Baltic Sea Anomaly was captured by Peter Lindberg, Dennis Aberg, and their Swedish Ocean X diving crew. The team was searching for treasure in the middle of the Gulf of Bothnia when their sonar scan revealed an object with peculiar characteristics of unnatural origin, which led to rumors about a sunken UFO being published in tabloid media. Experts and scientists generally agree that the picture most likely depicts a real geological feature. The crew claims that their photograph depicts a circular object with a 60-meter diameter that has elements like ramps, stairways, and other man-made buildings. The next year, the team went back to the location with the intention of getting a clearer shot, but they claimed unexplained electrical interference stopped them. Volker Bruckert, an associate professor of geology at Stockholm University, received samples of stone that Ocean X purportedly collected from the site. The majority of the samples, according to Bruckert's examination, are granites, gneisses, and sandstones. One loose fragment of basaltic volcanic rock, which is uncommon on the sea floor, was also present in the samples. According to Swedish geologists Fredrik Klenberg and Martin Jacobson, the chemical makeup of the supplied samples is similar to nodules that are frequently found at the bottom of the sea, and the minerals discovered, such as limonite and geothite, can in fact be created by nature. Several sites have criticized Ocean X for one of their sonar images. According to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, it's unreliable due to a number of distortions that make it virtually useless for locating an underwater structure. According to a story on MSNBC, the graphic outlines intended to imply the fictitious Starship Millennium Falcon was put over the solar picture by the tabloids, which might explain why the image has been interpreted as a flying saucer. According to scientist Charles Paul of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, the fuzzy sonar picture was probably an outcropping of rock, debris from a fishing trawler, or perhaps a school of fish. The narrative was curious and fun, but much ado about nothing, according to Paul. Goran Ekberg, a marine archaeologist at the Maritime Museum in Stockholm, responded to a photo published by the Swedish newspaper Expressen, allegedly taken by Ocean X during a dive to collect rock samples, saying, "A natural geological formation can't be ruled out. I agree the finding looks weird since it's completely circular, but nature has produced stranger things than that." The motivations behind Ocean X statements, which included plans to transport rich tourists to the location in a submarine, were questioned by Jonathan Hill of the Mars Spaceflight Facility. He suggested that it would have been easy to break off a piece and have it geologically tested, and said that test results showing it was simply rock would not have benefited Peter Lindberg. In 2012, he reported, "Whenever people make extraordinary claims, it's always a good idea to consider for a moment whether they're personally benefiting from the claim or if it's a truly objective observation." In a 2019 interview, Peter Lindberg said there could be a chance for a fresh trip through a television project in which they'd be participating. Number 1. Milky Sea Phenomenon. The Milky Sea Phenomenon, also known as Mareal, is an extremely uncommon type of bioluminescence in which luminescent bacteria interacting with one another generate a persistent glow that causes the water to sparkle gently like falling snow. The bizarre sight is little understood, but a chance encounter between a boat and a Mareal in Indonesia has provided scientists with a rare chance to research the Milky Sea phenomena and the methods we use to detect it. On August 2, 2019, something strange happened in the Ganesha vessel. A private yacht commanded by Johan Lemmens with a crew of 6 was traveling between Lombok, Indonesia and the Cocos Keeling Islands. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, they saw that the sea was white. The crew saw that there was no moon, the water appeared to be filled with plankton, and the bow wave appeared black, giving them the impression that they were sailing on snow. Their stories were able to support the satellite measurements taken, confirming an extraordinarily unusual occurrence that is predicted to happen just once or twice a year globally. Researchers examined images and audio recordings of the unique encounter, and their findings were later published in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The crew opted to get a bucket of water to have a closer look because they were curious and mesmerized by the light they described as akin to glow-in-the-dark stars or stickers. The light was unaffected by taking a sample, and strangely mixing it made the water get darker, the reverse effect of typical bioluminescence. In contrast to a previously proposed surface slick explanation, which indicated that Milky Sea movement may be caused by luminous microorganisms sitting in a thin coating, Captain Lemmens felt that the glow was located around 32.9 feet below the water's surface. The fact that the bioluminescence was unaffected by the movement of the boat suggests that it was located deeper in the water than this. One might assume that bioluminescence is a common occurrence and that there's nothing exceptional about it. Yet throughout history, people have only ever caught a glimpse of it by chance. It's only been investigated in the field once in 1985 when a research vessel came upon one off the coast of Yemen and had equipment on board to collect samples. Although there are still many unanswered concerns regarding the origin, makeup, and occupants of Milky Seas, the Ganesha's discoveries are significant since they've proven that Mareals may be seen in satellite images. In the future, this may make it possible for marine scientists to act at the right time and gain a better understanding of what's happening. Number 10. Camp Hero. At the eastern tip of Long Island, there's a place called Camp Hero State Park. It's within this seemingly normal park that something ominous is hiding. It's an abandoned military base, one that was supposedly the inspiration behind the wildly popular Netflix show Stranger Things. According to Joe Lafreno, who's been working at the park for 18 years, the abandoned facility has dominated his life and his nightmares. The thing about the abandoned Camp Hero is that for decades, locals in Montauk have told tales of secret government experiments happening inside the facility. There are rumors of government-funded mind control experiments and so much worse. Everything from time travel to teleportation, and even cloned children connected with wires and hidden in underground labs. The rumors started around 1992, 11 years after the military base had already been shut down and gone to neglect. People believed the US government was involved in Nazi-like experiments, almost certainly genetic and psychological experiments involving local children that they kidnapped. Park worker Joe Lafreno even believes he was one of the kidnapped children, and that the government performed horrible experiments on him and then erased his memory. None of these rumors or accusations have ever been confirmed. The truth is that Camp Hero has a military history going back to the Revolutionary War. It was used as an army base during World War II, designed to look like a fishing village to trick the Nazis. The Air Force took over the site shortly after the war, but it was finally shut down and abandoned in 1981. In the years since, the camp has slowly been falling apart. Its 90-foot tower is horribly rusted, with its dish looking like it's about to crash to the ground. Number 9. The Forgotten Cannon in Helsinki. Construction on the Viapori fortress in Finland began in 1748. Over the next 60 years, the fortress was built into a massive and formidable defense layer like something out of a James Bond movie. The stronghold was spread across 8 islands, 6 of them heavily fortified, and only about a mile from the city center of Helsinki. And although these days the fortress island chain is mostly used for family picnics, it was once a place of blood and sacrifice. It was the Swedish who commenced the construction of the fortress as a way to protect themselves against Russian expansion. Then, during the Finnish War, Sweden gave the fortress to Russia. This happened in May of 1808. The fortress then remained in the control of Russian forces until Finnish independence in 1917. They held on to the thing for over a century, using it as their own defensive fort. But when the Finnish took their country back, the fort was theirs and they renamed it Suomenlinna, meaning Castle of Finland. The fortress was used in 1939 when the Winter War broke out. It was a base for a small Finnish submarine fleet and allegedly spent some time as a prison camp for Russian soldiers. Many men were executed and slaughtered here, but all of that changed changed when the war was over and the fort was no longer useful. Although never fully abandoned, the fortress was left to decay on its own. Grass grew onto the tall fortress walls, the cannons were disarmed and left to rust, and these days the fort is little more than a tourist attraction. Its long-since dormant guns are still aimed at the sea. Number 8. The Cold War Submarine Graveyard. Located near Russia's Kola Peninsula in Olenia Bay, there's a graveyard of submarines from the Cold War. It's a fascinating place because it's at the edge of an otherwise beautiful tundra, a natural wilderness with animals like reindeer, polar bears, and even wolverines. Right at the border of this backcountry, half hidden by the water of the bay, there are abandoned submarines that once prowled the waters. Most of the submarines here were functional in the 1950s and 60s, but submarines don't exactly have the longest lifespans. Typically, submarine parts start to malfunction after 20 to 30 years of operation. Joints stop working properly, bits and pieces of gear become unreliable, and the underwater vessel needs to be retired. When that happened in the 1970s, the submarines were brought to Olenia Bay and left to rot. Some of the submarines were used as target practice over the years, shot at until they sank beneath the waves and out of sight. Others were just left on the shores of the bay to slowly leak oil and pollute the natural environment. It wasn't until the 1990s that a private company did what the government should have done and began disassembling the ships and recycling their materials. But even with that little bit of help, plenty of abandoned vessels are still there today. There are at least 7 or 8 gigantic submarines abandoned in the remote Russian wilderness. Number 7. Radioactive Helicopters. The Chernobyl exclusion zone in Ukraine is the area surrounding the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. You know, the one that had a meltdown in 1986 and caused one of the biggest radioactive disasters in history. And while most of what people see in the media from Chernobyl is the famous Ferris wheel, the abandoned buildings, and the creepy village, there is so much more. One of the most interesting places in Chernobyl is Rasovka. This was the burial ground for the military vehicles and other pieces of equipment used during the containment emergency to get the reactor under control. This place is a vehicle graveyard, but the vehicles are all extremely radioactive. There are buses, trucks, emergency vehicles, and even helicopters. The graveyard is home to multiple Mi-8 and Mi-6 helicopters, and even some wheeled armor carriers and chemical reconnaissance vehicles. The problem was that these vehicles were used to secure Chernobyl, to save everyone who could be saved, and to escort civilians away from the danger. But when all the work was done, the vehicles had absorbed too much of the dangerous radiation and had to be abandoned somewhere. Just like the entire Pripyat town that was completely deserted within hours, these vehicles were left to die. Number 6. The Vis Tunnels. Vis Island in the Adriatic Sea, officially part of Croatia, has played many roles throughout history. The island was occupied by the Greek thousands of years before modern times. The ruins of their lost towns can be found all across the island, and even the remains of an ancient fortress hidden within a hillside. But there are also a lot of relics from World War II scattered throughout the island. There are abandoned ships, forgotten planes, and all kinds of lost pieces of war equipment that are slowly being reclaimed by nature. In 1945, Vis Island was a major military base occupied by the Yugoslav army. The whole island was crawling with military personnel. It looked very different than it does today. There are at least 30 main military objects abandoned on the island: a command center, an army barracks, an underground hospital, and a secret missile base. There was a tunnel and bunker complex hiding underneath the surface, capable of blasting missiles from deep within the island. The control center was underground, with all eyes on Italy in case the Italians sent their troops over the border. Although these tunnels are now deserted, they haven't been destroyed. Visitors to Vis Island can still find the entrances to the dark and claustrophobic tunnels, and amazingly, they're mostly open. You can walk straight into the old World War II tunnels and start exploring the inside of the abandoned base. You can even poke your head into the old bunkers to inspect the rusted cannons still pointed at the sea. Would you like to check out the Vis Tunnels? Tell us why or why not in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 5. The Ghost Fleet of Truk Lagoon. On the bottom of the ocean floor in a Micronesian tropical paradise, there are hundreds of abandoned wrecks from World War II. This is the Ghost Fleet of Truk Lagoon, considered one of the largest underwater graveyards of military vehicles in the world. That's because here, for 2 days in 1944, Allied soldiers bombed the beaches relentlessly. The Caroline Islands in Micronesia were utterly obliterated, and it was all to put an end to Japan's imperial fleet once and for all. The lagoon was home to the most destructive fleet in the Japanese arsenal. It was basically the Japanese version of Pearl Harbor, a huge military base with all their best ships waiting to strike. But on February 17, 1944, 5 American fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, with support of over 500 aircraft, attacked the Japanese fleet at their own base. It was a surprise attack and a big gamble, but it paid off immensely. The Japanese had recently moved additional support ships into the area, making the target even juicier. The Americans managed to blow apart an estimated 250 Japanese aircraft and over 50 ships. Following the intense battle, the ships and aircraft that were destroyed were abandoned. Anything that couldn't be driven away was left to sink to the bottom of the lagoon. Almost all the remains down there are in the exact same spot they were nearly a century ago. Truk Lagoon is now one of the most popular diving sites in the world. It's the only place you can physically immerse yourself in the destruction of World War II, floating amongst the twisted metal and ripped wires of hundreds of Japanese vehicles. Number 4. Communist Airport. In Croatia, the Zeljava Air Base is an abandoned ruin located underneath a mountain. It's been empty and unused for over 2 decades, sitting right on the border of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The base is currently home to a small graveyard of fighter jets, reconnaissance aircraft, and various other airplanes slowly being reclaimed by nature. Most of the planes have already had all their major components ripped out or scavenged, and so they're really just empty husks. If anything, that's made it easier for nature to grow up and into them, while slowly dragging the aircraft down into the dirt. Most of these planes were abandoned at the former airbase when it was destroyed during the Bosnian War of 1992. Back when Yugoslavia existed, Zeljava Air Base was its largest underground airport. It was also one of the largest subterranean airports in Europe. The bunkers for the aircraft were carved into the side of a mountain, with the entirety of the base being sheltered under countless tons of rock and concrete. The base supposedly cost billions of dollars, but it was only used for a handful of years before conflict broke out and the whole place was destroyed. Number 3. The Reserve Fleet. The Suisun Bay Reserve Fleet is technically, according to the U.S. Maritime Administration, a fleet of vessels waiting to be put into service for matters of national defense or in the event of a national emergency. The Reserve Fleet isn't currently being used for anything, but it could be brought into service should some kind of large conflict break out. The idea behind the program started in 1946 when World War II ended. America thought it would be a good idea to have a reserve fleet in case something similar happened. Then, with the slow encroachment of the Cold War, a reserve fleet seemed even more necessary. The program had over 2,000 ships ready to go with a moment's notice by 1950. But as the years went by, the reserve fleet became less and less relevant, and many of the vehicles were abandoned. These days, only a small portion of the original vessels are still in the Suisun Bay, which is located off the coast of California. And as of February 2017, the government has decided to scrap every last remaining reserve ship. And so, even though some boats are still sitting in the water, they're effectively abandoned. The reserve fleet has been disbanded, and the boats are all being sent to their death. Number 2. Abandoned Battery. The J-4 abandoned naval battery was ready for action as recently as the 1980s. It's currently a decommissioned and abandoned piece of military history, but was once part of a larger defense system across the Spanish coastline. Originally built in 1936, the J-4 battery was connected by a series of underground tunnels to other batteries all overlooking the coastline. The job of this wall of defense was to keep invaders out of Spain. When it was originally built, the battery was equipped with 2 British naval guns that were salvaged from a sunken battleship in 1923. But for all the effort, the battery never saw that much action, and by the time the 1980s rolled around, the whole place was deemed redundant and decommissioned. It's now an abandoned ruin. Number 1. Remote Alaskan Bombs. In the middle of nowhere, Alaska, Army engineers were recently called in to solve a problem. A crew with the Army Corps of Engineers traveled to Fort Glenn to safely clear and detonate bombs left over from World War II. But before we get to the bombs, let's look at the history of Fort Glenn. It was a military installation built in secret on the Aleutian Islands about 850 miles from Anchorage in Alaska. It became a functional military outpost in late 1941. One of the main purposes of the remote base was to dispose of munitions and explosives. There was a small chunk of land set aside to throw bombs, bullets, and all other things that go boom into the trash. The issue today is that not all of the ordnance was detonated, and live bombs and explosives were thrown into these garbage pits. Then, when the war was over, Fort Glenn was abandoned, and nobody ever went back to occupy the island. The workers with the Army Corps were prepared to extract a massive number of abandoned explosives, projectiles, landmines, rockets, and even grenades. They were expecting over 2,000 individual items to be dug out of the soil on the island. What they hadn't expected was to come across multiple 500-pound bombs and about 2 dozen medium bombs of 20 pounds each. It took 2 summers between 2020 and 2021 just to rid the abandoned fort of its lingering explosives. Which of these abandoned pieces of military history did you find the most interesting? Number 10. The Maisto Tank. During World War I, Germany developed what was, at the time, the most terrifying war machine on the planet. The A-7V was a heavy tank introduced into the war in 1918 during its late stages. 100 models were initially ordered, but only 20 were finished and sent on to the battlefield. The vehicle was heavily armored and was the only tank produced by Germany during this war. World War I was a time of great technological innovation. The British were the first to bring their tanks to the battlefield in September 1916. The Germans had nothing to counter these British armored vehicles. Up until that point, wars had just been fought by men with guns and swords. not armored vehicles and flimsy airplanes. This was a whole new realm of warfare. Taking their inspiration from the British, the Germans designed their own monstrous tanks to be even more indestructible and frightening. They armed the A-7V with 6 7.92mm machine guns and a massive 5.7cm cannon in the front. It had a top speed of about 9 miles per hour, a 24-wheel suspension, and such great power that it could crawl straight across trenches. They were first used at the St. Quentin Canal on March 21, 1918. 5 tanks were sent out, 3 of them suffered mechanical failure, but the other 2 proved to be enough to stop the British in their tracks. These days, there's only one A-7V remaining from the war. It's called the Maisto Tank, and it was captured by Australian troops during the conflict. Afterwards, it was taken to Brisbane to be displayed in the Queensland Museum. Number 9. Sarin Gas. One of the worst chemical developments ever made by Nazis in World War II was sarin gas. Hitler was presented with a uniquely evil opportunity in World War II to use one of the most terrifying nerve agents ever developed by scientists. But oddly enough, he didn't. Historians say Hitler himself was so appalled by the destructive capabilities the gas had that even he didn't want to use it against enemies. The creation of sarin gas goes all the way back to 1938 with a German scientist named Gerhard Schrader. It was his job to create a new pesticide to kill weevils found in German fields. What he made by mistake, though, was a toxic gas far too dangerous to be sprayed on crops. He mixed phosphorus and cyanide and came up with the first batch of one of the world's worst and most toxic chemical compounds. But then, still not quite satisfied, he tinkered with it to make the substance even more threatening. Germany produced about 12,000 tons of sarin gas before the war was finished. They had enough on hand to kill millions of people. Hitler could have dropped sarin bombs on London and completely obliterated the city, but for some reason, he never did. In the early years of war, military officers pressured Hitler to use the gas against their enemies, but he declined time after time. It's believed Hitler's reluctance to use the chemical weapons came from his own experience in October 1918. While fighting in the First World War, Hitler fell victim to a devastating mustard gas attack. He saw firsthand how the gas was capable of blinding and mutilating his friends, and he likely didn't want to do that with something much worse than the mustard gas he experienced. Number 8. The Flamethrower. The German engineer Richard Fiedler was responsible for creating one of the deadliest weapons in World War I. In 1900, his new invention called the Flammenwerfer was accepted by the German army. In 1911, special assault engineers used it. But this new weapon really took off in 1915, February 26 to be exact. The German 3rd Guard Pioneer Regiment used the Flammenwerfer, better known as the Flamethrower in English, to burn French trenches on the Western Front. The Flamethrower wasn't a particularly powerful weapon. It only had a short range and needed constant fuel in order to work. But as a new invention, the Flamethrower wreaked psychological havoc on Germany's enemies. Since World War I was mostly trench warfare, seeing a roaring hot flame gushing into the trenches and burning men alive put great fear into soldiers. The weapon could shoot a searing hot jet of flame over 20 yards. If a soldier happened to be caught in the flames, they wouldn't necessarily die. Instead, they'd be roasted alive and their skin would get burned off, leaving them forever disfigured. There was something utterly nightmarish about the flamethrower that terrified English and French fighters. The Allied forces also had no defense against it, other than just running and hoping they didn't catch on fire. Number 7. Vengeance Weapon 1. Vengeance Weapon 1 was the mother of all bombs. At least, it was until the nuclear missile came around. The very first Vengeance Weapon, or V1 for short, was launched on London City on June 13, 1944. This was about 1 week after the Allies landed in Normandy and the Nazi war machine was grinding down to a miserable end. Like a dying beast lashing out, Germany tried retaliating using their own newly developed missile system. They sent out their vengeance against the citizens of London in the form of an 1,800-pound warhead. The first bomb struck down beside a railway bridge and killed 6 civilians. The V1 flying bomb was never intended to be used as a weapon of mass destruction. The Germans designed it to attack radio control systems and take out specific military targets. Because the rocket could be directed somewhere with extremely high precision, it was meant to take out strategic points. But as Germany found themselves getting assaulted from all sides, they used their new weapon system as a cheap way to instill terror. Unfortunately for Germany, their V1 bombs came too late to make any major difference in the war. But had they been given just a bit more time, the Germans could have used these bombs with devastating effectiveness. They had about 80 launch sites built across northern France, each one capable of launching 15 V1 rockets per day. Each rocket could reach speeds of 400 miles per hour and could cruise at up to 3,000 feet. Number 6. the German U-boat. The most significant advancement in military equipment in World War I was the German U-boat. This was the most formidable naval weapon used in both World War I and World War II. After the First War, the Germans took this massive success and tried to amplify it, attempting to make the boats better, more undetectable, and deadlier. According to history, these German death machines sank nearly 8,000 merchant vessels and warships and killed countless people. The U in U-boat stands for Unterseeboot, or undersea boat in English. These early submarines were so effective that they could attack and destroy ships over 20 times larger than them without even getting spotted. They terrorized the Atlantic Ocean, disrupted shipping lanes, blocked supplies for the Allies, and just caused insane havoc. But the truth is that for those inside the U-boats, life was beyond miserable. Sailors weren't able to take showers, they never changed their clothes, 50 men shared 2 toilets, and the whole vessel stank like pure sweat and diesel. Mildew would grow on the men's clothes and in their shoes from the heat and the damp conditions. It was a rotten, claustrophobic experience that typically lasted at least 2 months straight without a single breath of fresh air in that time. It'd be enough to drive men crazy. Have you ever been in a submarine? Tell us in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 5. The sound gun. One of the most bizarre secret weapons developed by the Nazis was called the Schallkanon, or sound gun. The idea behind this weapon was that if German scientists could produce high enough frequency waves, they could potentially direct them towards incoming enemy soldiers and make their eardrums burst. The device would have rendered thousands of Allied soldiers instantly deaf. It would have been similar to if the cabin of an airplane depressurized and everyone on board had their eardrums explode. To begin the development of such a destructive weapon, German scientists experimented on prisoners. One of the main things they were testing was infrasound. They learned that by exposing someone to intense infrasound, they would get thrown into states of panic. The victims also experienced explosive diarrhea, dizziness, and abdominal pain during the trials. For the Nazis, this seemed like an extremely useful weapon to use against their enemies. But like so many other weird weapons they developed, the sound gun was a total bust. The Nazis couldn't figure out how to accurately concentrate infrared sound into a direct beam. They always ended up making themselves sick and forcing their own scientists to experience panic attacks. Number 4. Thor. In World War II, Karl Gerhardt, nicknamed Thor after the Norse god of thunder, was a self-propelled siege mortar engine designed by Rheinmetall AG. The German automotive and arms manufacturer designed and built one of the biggest and heaviest siege weapons in all of human history. Its massive cannon could shoot a 24-inch shell. The guns that shot these massive bullets were so big that they could only be operated by using a crane. The shells themselves had to be carried using modified rail cars. 7 of these monstrous instruments were built, but only 6 of them were used in actual combat between 1941 and 1945. The most famous assault that utilized the Thor weapon was when Germans attacked the Soviet strongholds of Brest-Litovsk and Sevastopol. They were also used in retaliation against the Polish Warsaw Resistance in 1944. Only one weapon has survived to this day, and nothing like it has been built since. The siege engine was designed specifically to obliterate concrete, shatter bunker walls, and decimate cities. The original shells created craters up to 49 feet wide and 16 feet deep. The force of Thor's shells smashing against the ground was similar to a comet crashing down from space. Number 3. The Comet. Speaking of comets, the Me-163b1A Comet was one of Germany's most desperate attempts at bombing the Allies. This was the only rocket-propelled interceptor on record ever used. The Luftwaffe, Germany's terrifying air force, used the Comets near the end of World War II in an insane bid to bomb the Allies while they closed in on Germany. The interceptor began life as a research project in the late 1930s, but it wasn't until 1941 that the rocket motor began its flight trials. At the same time, the motor inside the Comet propelled the aircraft to a maximum speed far greater than other vehicles at the time. It was the world's first jet fighter using advanced technology well ahead of its time. And for this reason too, things didn't work out quite the way Germany had hoped. The only Luftwaffe unit given operational Comets, which were basically just prototypes, was Fighter Wing 400. It was their duty to protect the oil refineries in Leipzig. They got into a bloody battle with the U.S. Army Air Force on August 16, 1944. The Americans had never seen such fast flying machines before. The Comets tore through the skies like falling stars, reaching speeds of a supposed 700 miles per hour. But in the end, they proved futile. The Germans suffered heavy casualties, and the Comets didn't do much to save the day. They were fast, but they lacked the endurance and reliability necessary to win wars. Number 2. The Sun Gun. In World War II, the Nazis worked on creating a weapon that could destroy all their enemies by harnessing the sun's power. They wanted to focus the sun's raw energy into a single beam that could burn and incinerate anything it touched. It was a crazy idea, like something a supervillain in a comic book would come up with. But this wasn't Lex Luthor, it was Hitler. He was real. Nazi scientists tried to figure out how to make a gigantic mirror that they could send into space. They hoped to set the mirror in orbit around Earth and somehow position it remotely to direct the sun's beams towards specific targets. The idea allegedly came from the renowned rocket scientist German Uboat in 1923. He drew up plans to make a mirror about 0.62 miles in diameter, then launch it into space. It would act as a super cannon, setting fire to massive stretches of enemy territory. Theoretically, the mirror would be so powerful it could vaporize an entire city in one shot. Luckily for the human race, the development of the sun gun took too long for the Nazis to use it. Hermann estimated that it would take at least 15 years to build a mirror in the sky. The materials would have to be brought into space using rockets and then connected onto a superstructure. Maybe the technology could have eventually gotten there, but not back then. And by the time anyone could even consider starting such a long and expensive mission, the war was finished. Number 1. Kumlauf. The curved barrel gun attachment was a very strange weapon designed by Germans in World War II. It was called the Kumlauf, and technically it wasn't an entirely functioning weapon. It was more so an attachment that could be mounted onto an existing machine gun. Still, if it had worked properly, it could have been a seriously devastating piece of equipment. The Kumlauf was designed as a barrel attachment for the Sturmgewehr 44 to allow a shooter to fire around corners without putting himself in direct lines of fire. The attachment even came with a periscope device so that riflemen could pick targets without even leaving the safety of the trench. It was a very cool idea on paper, but a massive failure in reality. The Germans designed multiple versions with angles ranging from 30 to 90 degrees. The only one that even remotely functioned correctly was the 30-degree curved barrel, and even then it could only fire about 300 rounds before it burst apart and was rendered useless. It also didn't fire bullets as expected. Because of the curve, the bullets were placed under too much stress. They would shatter before even leaving the barrel, then come flying out at the end as shrapnel. The only real use the weapon modifications had in battle was for tank defense. The curved barrel could be fit to a roof or the side of a vehicle, and men could fire in all directions from safety. They were also great for close combat since soldiers could fire hot shrapnel around corners. Still, it wasn't as effective as the Germans hoped, and it certainly didn't help change the tides of war. Which of these weapons do you think was the most terrifying? Let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching the video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe and come back soon for another amazing video right here on American Eye.